Hey guys, thanks for coming to the channel again. And we are approaching winter now. The winter solstice is only a few days away, and we can look forward to lengthening days after that, more and more sunshine. But a combination of not much sunshine, the shortest days, and cold temperatures create some of the coldest water temperatures of the year here towards the end of December. And then of course cold fronts, extended cloudy days, ice and snow will, take it down to its bottom limit. So in the winter time, there's several techniques which we've been talking about in some of my previous videos that you may or may not have watched on wintertime fishing. There's several techniques, but one of the things we want to talk about today is one of the best big fish techniques of all time, if not the best big fish technique of all time, maybe apart from niche type baits like giant swim baits and things like that. So today we're going to talk about jigs, and we're talking about skirted jigs and which ones should you be throwing now in cold water wintertime. Which ones? So, and just so I can jog your memory, cold water for me is anything from about 48 degrees on down to frozen. And of course, the colder it gets, the less active the fish are. So the first thing you want to do with a jig when the water gets cold, say under 48 degrees, is you want to do away with certain types of jig trailers. Jig trailers that worked for you in warmer weather are not going to work for you as well in colder water. And I'm not saying that they won't work, because absolutely everything can work at one time or another. But as a general rule, you want to do away with these types of trailers. Heavy action twin tails, speed crawls, and things that have a lot of movement to them. Because like we've talked about, a lot of movement is not a natural thing once the water gets cold, because everything that lives in the water, for the most part, is cold-blooded, and their metabolism slows down with the water temperature. So anything that's kind of running around all fast or flippity-floppity in the water that time, or this time of year when the water gets cold, it's not going to be natural. A small bass is, he's going to try pretty much anything because he doesn't know any better. But a more educated, older, wiser bass is going to go, that's not right. So realistic lures that mimic what's in the habitat for them to eat, lures that are mimicking the action of the things that are existing in the habitat at particular times of year are going to be better choices for you. So what kind of trailers are you going to want to be throwing now that the water temperature is cold? You're going to want to be throwing super chunks or small. This is a small super chunk. Are you going to want to be throwing like a regular style chunk bait? Now this is a bigger one. They make them smaller, and you're going to put the chunk bait on to match the size of the bait that you're throwing. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But if you don't have any smaller chunks, it's real simple. You can take a pair of scissors and you can clip this thing down to any size that you want. I would recommend that you narrow out these. If nothing else, you would just narrow out by clipping off the sides of this in the wintertime if you want to use this larger bait. And you'd only use this larger chunk on a larger jig. Now that being said, if you're throwing a larger jig, you may catch the biggest fish of the winter on a larger jig. I'm talking about a big bulky jig, a lot of hair, heavy, and a big heavy trailer on it. You may catch the biggest fish of the year, but you're not going to get a lot of bites. And that may be good to put in the rod locker. If you're fishing a tournament in the wintertime, you may want to pull that jig out after you've caught your limit and go for that kicker that you need to win the tournament. But before you get to that point, you're probably going to want to downsize your jigs. Like you pretty much downsize everything in the wintertime. You're going to want to downsize them. And by that, you can do a couple of different things. You can take a jig and turn it into a finesse jig, right? You clip the top of the skirt off there and then clip the bottom skirt at the bottom of the hook. Maybe pull some strands out of it to thin it out a little bit. Now this is a little ball-headed jig, but you can do it with whatever jig you need in the situation that you're fishing. Whether you're fishing brush, you're going to want a brush jig, one with a nose tie on the front. If you're fishing rock, you're going to want a football jig, something like that comes through the rock better. And if you're fishing docks or more open cover, you're going to want some type of Arky style jig, which is a jig where the line tie is not on top, at about a 45, and that gives the Arky jigs give the bait a lot more action than a brush jig will give you. Brush jig's purpose is to be able to get through the brush. That's where its action is developed as it's working through the brush. Football jig is developed to do the shimmy shake when you're coming through rocks, and the wide head keeps it from snagging in all the little cracks and crevices. And then the Arky jig is more of a dock, open water type jig for working the bottom, where you want to impart the most action into the jig while it's on the bottom with every pull. So that being said, you're going to want to downsize your jig either to like a finesse style jig, or you can get, Ike and Kitech make these little tungsten jigs, which are a little bitty. They got a small hook in them. So you're not going to want to put this jig on big heavy line, which big heavy line is something you're going to want to get away from anyhow come winter time. You're going to want to lighten your line up to smaller line anyhow, because the water tends to be a lot more clear. But these little smaller jigs, see, this jig is, it's not even as far to my middle knuckle long compared to this football jig, which is, it's 3/4 of the length of my finger. It's a way bigger jig. So if you downsize your jigs to smaller finesse style jigs with smaller non-action trailers, you get a lot more bites in the wintertime fishing. So what weights and colors do you need to be throwing? Well, the weight is always going to be dependent on how deep you're fishing or the structure that you're fishing in. If you're throwing a football jig and it's getting hung up in the rocks, then you're going to want to lighten that football jig up a little bit. If you're throwing a brush jig and it's getting hung up in the brush, you're going to want to lighten that jig up a little bit. If you're fishing shallow water, say 8 feet or less, you probably get away with a 1/4 ounce or 3/8 ounce jig. But once you get over about 8 feet or so, you're going to want to be moving up towards a 1/2 ounce. And once you get, 12 to 15 feet, you're going to want a 3/4 ounce jig. Those are good rule of thumb, because you want to, in the wintertime especially, you got to keep bottom contact. You don't want your jig, when you're working it or pulling it, coming up off the bottom and then having to settle back. You want to keep bottom contact all the time with a jig in the wintertime. And in the winter, you're going to be dealing mostly, unless you've had storms and you're fishing rivers, that have a lot of runoff in them, or the backs of creeks that have a lot of runoff in them, you're going to mostly be fishing clearer water, because there's simply no algae bloom in the wintertime for most rivers and lakes. So, and the boat traffic's way down, so you're not getting everything stirred up as bad, but that algae bloom goes away and it creates a much clearer water situation. So bass like the clear water in the wintertime much better than they do dirty water, so I would generally look for more clear water in the wintertime anyhow. So what colors would you be throwing in clear water? Well, you're going to want to stick with natural colors. So you're going to want your greens with a little brown, maybe a little gold in there. You're going to want your little brown and orange tiger stripe, or brown and amber tiger stripe with a brown head. If you get a little bit dingier water, you may throw the same color, little brown and orange tiger stripe, but it has a little flash of chartreuse in the back. Your peanut butter and jelly colors are all good colors in clearish water. Your pretty much straight brown or brown and green pumpkin, or again, if you get a little bit more color, green pumpkin with some blue flash in it. And if you're fishing dark days, or the water's, you know, somewhat dingy, then you're probably going to stick with a black or black and blue, or if it's dingy and sunny, maybe even a black and red flake. So those are the colors that you're going to want to be throwing with these jigs. Line size is important. I probably am going to fish mostly in the wintertime with most jigs. I'm probably going to throw about 16-pound fluorocarbon. I'm probably not going to throw my 20 and 25-pound fluorocarbon much in the wintertime because it kind of dulls the action. Now, one more thing we can talk about is the skirt type. So most skirts that you buy today are silicone or siliconized skirts. Well, in cold water, silicone tends to stiff it up and pretty much turn into a brick and doesn't move very well at all. So one way to get over that in the wintertime is to throw a living rubber jig skirt. And they come in different thicknesses. I'm talking about the actual strand thicknesses. And the thicker the strand, probably the better the action's going to be in cold water. When you move that jig, that living rubber's going to flare right back out again, where the silicone's just going to kind of drag behind it in a straight line. You know, it's not going to do much of anything. So as far as like if you got a dead stick the jig because the fish are really inactive, that living rubber would just kind of sit there and pulse, you know, especially if you have any type of current or wind going on at the time. So quick recap, if you want to catch more bass in the wintertime when the water temperature is below 48 degrees, look for clear water, downsize your jigs, get the action out of your trailers so they don't have much action to them. Go with living rubber if you can find it, and use natural colors, and you will catch more fish. Again, thanks for watching, and have a blessed day.